Good afternoon, my friends. We are honored today by the presence of our friend, the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Venerable Bodhi is one of the most important scholars of Buddhism alive in the world today. Venerable Bodhi obtained his PhD in philosophy in 1972. And being a philosophy major, he could have gotten a job at, McDonald's or something. But he didn't. Instead, he became a monk. And he received full ordination in 1973. He was appointed editor of the Buddhist Publication Society in 1984 and is president in 1988. And Venerable Bodhi has many important scholarly publications to his credit, including at least 4 volumes of Buddhist scriptures. And the volume is like this. I used to read those stuff in addition to coding, which is why I think I did from the senior prom. Just kidding. In May 2000, he gave the keynote address at the United Nations on his first official celebration of Vesak. He currently teaches at Chuangyen Monastery and the Bodhi Monastery. And in person, I found Venerable Bodhi to be the stereotypical enlightened being, wise, intelligent, compassionate, funny, humble, the usual. Sure. And also he speaks Chinese. And my friends, please welcome the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Okay, first I want to thank my old friend Meng, old friend from a year and a half ago, for inviting me to come and speak to you today, and to thank all of you for attending this talk. Here at Google, I feel like I'm at the brain center of the universe. Not flattering you in the sense that all of you have master brains, but this is the nerve center of the entire world's communications and information. I know Mr. Meng is a great humorist, so I thought that if I gave a talk without giving it something of a humorous title, it would go down flat. So I call the talk, It Takes Two to Tango, but the subtitle gives it a serious tone, The Human Future and the Future of Buddhism. It's been said by some commentators that the meeting of Buddhism with Western civilization has been one of the most significant cultural encounters of the past few centuries. The West first encountered Buddhism perhaps in the 18th century. In the 19th century, the tempo of studies of Buddhism started to increase. By the 20th century, Buddhists were coming to the West in order to propagate the Buddha's teachings. Scholars and students of Buddhism were going to Asia to learn Buddhism. And now in the 21st century, in the US, we have many Buddhist centers, Buddhist monasteries, Buddhist temples, Buddhist teachers. And yet, even now, the full potential of this encounter of the West with Buddhism has not yet been realized. Usually, when we speak about the meeting of the West with Buddhism, we pose the question, what is the significance of this encounter from our own Western point of view? Buddhism teaches the doctrine of non-self, so we should put the self aside, but we're always phrasing the question, what does Buddhism hold out for us? What is the implication of Buddhism for the future of Western civilization? In this talk, I want to play both sides of the fence. That is, I want to view the encounter of Buddhism in the West from both points of view. I want to raise the question, what does Buddhism offer Western civilization at this particular juncture? And also I want to raise the question, what does Buddhism have to learn from the West? Or what does the West have to contribute to the unfolding and development and future evolution of Buddhism? As I look out upon contemporary human situation, both in the United States and abroad, I see that our future is in serious jeopardy. Our future as a civilization, and perhaps even our future as a species. I don't think I'm exaggerating, and I don't think that, despite my title, that this is anything of a joking matter. At the same time, I don't want to fall into a grim type of pessimism. Despite the seriousness of the problems that we face, I still have the faith and the hope that we human beings will come to our senses before it's too late. I want to raise this paper a bit. I also hope that Buddhism might be able to transform some of the trends that appear so threatening to our human future. At the same time, I also hope that the meeting of the West with Buddhism will cause a fermentation in Buddhism that will serve as a catalyst to awaken certain potentials lying dormant in the Buddha's teaching that could not appear before it made this encounter with the West. I first want to try to support my statement that we live in dangerous times by mentioning some of the major crises that confront us in our present situation. Throughout history, we have always assumed that we had a future. The future has been seen as a given dimension of time. And we always felt that we could count on having a future that would recede ever further into the horizons of our imagination. Today, however, it is precisely the reality of the future that has become a question for us. There are certain present-day trends which suggest that our future might be endangered. An end to the future, at least to the human future, is now easily imaginable. Even if the endpoint of the future doesn't occur in our own lifetime, there's a very real danger that it might occur at some point in the present century, even during the lifetimes of your children or grandchildren. During our daily lives, when our attention is involved in our day-to-day tasks and projects, these kinds of thoughts normally don't trouble us. But if we step back for a few moments and reflect, we could easily see that these claims are not exaggeration. The dangers are very real, and when we take them seriously, as they should be taken, they can send a chill down our spines. As human beings, we feel that we have an overriding responsibility to preserve a future for humanity. We feel obliged to create for generations to come a peaceful and affluent world. We feel that we are obliged to leave our descendants a world that will be conducive to happiness and well-being, a world that will give meaning and purpose to their lives. And yet, if we look around us, we can see that we might be doing exactly the opposite. We're acting in such a way that we may leave future generations a battered world, a world darkened by poverty, conflict, pollution. We may even be leaving them an unlivable world. In effect, we might be leaving them no world at all. Okay, I want to mention 4 current trends that throw our future into doubt. I won't dwell on these in any detail. There are analysts far better than myself that could explain them at length. But I just want to touch on several of these in order to support my claim that our future is in danger. Okay, the first of these is the persistence of warfare, especially the danger of nuclear warfare. For the US right now, we've been caught in the quagmire of 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, wars that were started as a result of disinformation and over-hasty decisions. These wars have claimed the lives of thousands of Americans. They've damaged very many more thousands of American lives, and they've destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands, maybe even more than 1 million innocent Iraqis and Afghans. We pour vast amounts of money into these wars, even more than $1 trillion, an amount of money that's a bit hard to imagine. You know, it's 1 billion with 3 zeros after it. And this is money that with better foresight and more compassion could have been spent much more fruitfully on programs of social development, education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, both nationally and globally. In his brilliant speech, Beyond Vietnam, Martin Luther King said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than it does on social uplift is approaching spiritual death." I hope we aren't yet reaching that point, but the way our national leaders have locked us into the task of continually sponsoring military programs doesn't warm my heart, and I assume it's not warming to your hearts. And not only are these wars pointless and expensive, but the most remarkable phenomenon of present-day warfare is its cold impersonality. Nowadays, the wars are fought largely by unmanned drones, which are operated by youngsters who might be sitting in their cubicles in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, examining screens and pressing buttons. Often we read that these drone attacks wind up killing not militants, not terrorists, but groups of civilians who might be celebrating a wedding or gathering for some other communal function. A second dark blot on our future is the persistence of poverty and hunger. Instead of endeavoring to distribute wealth more equitably in order to lift people out of poverty, those in positions of power impose policies that channel the wealth upwards from the lower and middle classes to the corporate elite, so that at present, I believe 1% of the US population owns about 25% of the wealth in the US. Okay, so billions of people in South Asia and Africa are Okay, so billions of people in South Asia and Africa are swallowed up by poverty, but poverty also ravages many communities in the US and Eastern Europe. So this leaves us with the sense that our economic and financial systems are not working in an equitable manner. They benefit those who know how to manipulate the system, while they exclude those who lack the power, ambition, and skills to push their way to the top. A third factor closely related to increasing poverty is the sense that our democratic system is no longer working to the benefit of the governed. I think this factor is partly what explains the rise of these Tea Party movements, so that ever more people are convinced that the government no longer truly represents them, that it's no longer serving our benefit, no longer fulfilling our own hopes and dreams. Every few years we have an election, which is usually conducted with something of the spectacular glamour of an Academy Awards ceremony. And then once the elections are over and the politicians go to their offices, they usually fulfill the expectations of the corporations that sponsor their campaigns rather than the wishes of the people who elect them to power. The fourth threat at Google, the nerve center of the world, power failures. I could expect that in Sri Lanka, but not at Google. Maybe I'll send some technicians from Sri Lanka to California. Okay, the fourth threat to our future might be the most serious of all. And this is the accelerating crisis of climate change, particularly global warming. I think most of you are probably familiar with the consequences of this. And yet what's most remarkable is that this problem receives very little attention in the mainstream media. So last year I was to go to I went to the climate conference in Copenhagen. And before the conference took place, a poll was conducted of the US public to determine what percentage of people knew the subject of the conference in Copenhagen. And I think roughly 28% of the public knew that it was about climate change. A large percent thought it was about international drug trafficking. Another percent thought that it was about trade regulations. Another large percent thought it was about negotiations over the war in Afghanistan, something like that. But so few people are aware of the reality and the gravity of the problem of climate change. And the attention of the span of Americans' attention is very short and easily clouded by disinformation. So now such a large percentage of people think that all of these reports about global warming and climate change are just disinformation which is sent out by professors at departments of climatology in the universities in order to secure their jobs and to push a liberal socialist agenda in American politics. Okay, so we have these four factors, at least, taken together: persistent wars, economic inequality, ineffective political institutions, and accelerating climate change. And when we look at them together, we can see that the prospects for the human future are not very bright. Okay, now I come to my second theme, which is the relevance of Buddhism to the human predicament. Okay, in my way of thinking, any solution to the global problems that we face must involve three interrelated processes. The first is that there must be the nurturing of the moral and spiritual development of the person. That is, any solution requires an inward transformation. Second, we must be able to bring to fulfillment the best potentials of our communal life so that we can create a peaceful and harmonious world that will further the moral and spiritual development of the individual person. And third, we must preserve human civilization by enabling those forces, or by controlling those forces that threaten to overwhelm it. These three, in my view, are intricately interrelated, and we could discern a certain causal progression among them. First, the most basic task is to promote the spiritual development of the person. And this is generally the way religion works. Rather than trying directly to remodel forms of social organization, religion addresses people in their inward depths, and its primary call is for an inner transformation. But this is also a transformation that we cannot separate from the ways we engage with the world around us. When people act in accordance with the positive values of religion, the prospects for a harmonious communal life will improve. And when society becomes peaceful and harmonious, then civilization will be preserved and protected from the negative forces that threaten to overwhelm it. So I intend to treat Buddhism from these three angles. But first, just a little background information, though some of you might be already aware of this, but I'll just give a little background information on Buddhism. Buddhism originated from the life and teaching of the historical Buddha Gautama, who probably lived in the 5th century BC. Even though his life has been embroidered with many myths and legends, behind them we could still detect the life story of a real historical person. He was born into a small republic in the Himalayan foothills in a region that now lies in southern Nepal. At the age of 16, he married, he lived in royal luxury, and at a certain point, his wife gave birth to a son. When he reached full maturity at the age of 29, he started to reflect on the problems of human existence, particularly the problem of suffering. And as part of an attempt to find a solution to this problem, he renounced the life of the palace and went forth as a wandering ascetic, seeking the way to enlightenment or awakening, the way to utterly resolve the problem of human suffering. He practiced the various types of meditation that were available in his time, but wasn't satisfied with them. Then he practiced extreme asceticism and self-mortification for 6 years until he carried these ascetic practices almost to the point of death. He concluded that the practice of asceticism would not lead to enlightenment, so then he began to take normal food again, regained his health, sat down at the bank of a river beneath a widespread tree, and resolved not to rise up until he had reached his goal. So that night he entered into deeper and deeper stages of meditation until by the time morning came, he was the enlightened one, Buddha, the one who is woken up from the delusion of ignorance. After spending several weeks in deep meditation beneath the Bodhi tree, he decided to go forth and to teach the truths that he had discovered. He called his teaching the Dharma, and he went from village to village, town to town, teaching and guiding others along the path to liberation. He attracted a large number of men and women who wanted to follow him into the homeless life. So in this way, he established the monastic Sangha, the order of monks and nuns. He continued to teach for 45 years, from the age of 35 to the age of 80, until he passed away in the small Indian town of Kusinara. Okay, now we raise the question why the Buddha's teaching has been spreading so rapidly and attracting so much interest in the United States today. I mean, this is a teaching 2,500 years old. It might seem that we could assign it to the museums and the textbooks of ancient history, and yet we have scientists, economists, a few politicians, educated people attracted to Buddhism, practicing Buddhism, even becoming Buddhist monks and nuns. So how do we understand this? To explain this, I would resort to two factors. One is the aim of the Buddha's teaching. The other is its methodology. As to the aim, the Buddha formulated his teaching in a way that directly addresses the critical problem at the heart of human existence. This is the problem of suffering in all of its range, from bodily suffering to the inevitability of death, to the problems of grief, worry, anxiety, anguish, and despair. And what the Buddha teaches is not only suffering, but also how to reach the end of suffering, how to find right in this present life the highest happiness and the most exalted peace. In order to clarify this, the Buddha compressed his full realization into a very convenient framework, which he calls the Four Noble Truths. So the first is the truth that life involves suffering. The second is the truth that the cause of suffering is craving, self-centered desire rooted in blind ignorance. The third truth declares that suffering can be ended with the attainment of wisdom and mental purification. And the fourth truth states that there is a practical way to reach the end of suffering, and that is the Noble Eightfold Path. As we can see from the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's methodology shows extraordinary psychological insight. The Buddha explains suffering not by reference to some outside factor, but he traces it to its roots within our own mind, to our ignorance and craving, to greed, hatred, and delusion. And since suffering arises from our own minds, the end of suffering, the cure, also lies within our own mind. By dispelling our mental defilements, our mental obsessions, and gaining clear insight into the nature of reality. To bridge these 2 points, the beginning point of suffering, the end point of liberation, the Buddha offers a very clear path of practice, the Noble Eightfold Path, which begins with right view of the basic truths about our existence, proceeds through the right intention to undertake the training, then leads into the 3 ethical factors of right speech, right action, right speech, right action, right livelihood, then proceeds to the 3 factors of mental training, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. When all these 8 factors of the path are brought to maturity, then one gains insight into the true nature of existence and attains the goal of wisdom and liberation of the mind. When we consider the special relevance of the Buddha's teaching to our own time, what I find especially important to note is that Buddhism can provide helpful insights and practices across a wide spectrum of disciplines, from philosophy and psychology to medical care, ecology, even the running of a corporation, as our Meng here will be showing in his own book when it gets completed and published. So those who feel attracted to a particular aspect of Buddhist teaching don't have to buy the whole Buddhist show, so to speak, but they could take up whatever aspect attracts them and use it for their own purposes. The Buddha says, I don't have the closed fist of a teacher. So whatever is of benefit to somebody, they can take and use in their own lifetime, as in applying it to their own life. Okay, one of the main ways in which Buddhism has been getting a foothold in the West, and one of its greatest promises for the unfolding of Western civilization, has been through its systems of meditation. I also believe that this is one of the most important ways that Buddhism can help us to emerge from our own confusion and spiritual emptiness. As I said earlier, the dangers that we face, if we really investigate where they originate from, they don't originate from weapons, from industry, from corporate activities themselves, but they originate from our ways of engaging with the world. That is, they arise from greed, hatred, fear, and ignorance. And meditation is precisely the means that the Buddha has prescribed to help us face and overcome these mental afflictions. So in order to help the world to avert a destructive crisis, what we have to do is to strike a balance between external change and internal change. But without internal change, mere outer change, changes in governments, changes in politicians, changes in institutions, changes in economic policies, will be only superficial. For any outer change to be truly enduring, to truly strike at the root, it has to be accompanied by and driven by an inner change in people's hearts and minds. And the most effective way to bring about that change is through the practice of meditation. Sometimes people think that meditation is just a way of escaping from the problems of the world or just a way of relaxing the mind. But actually, meditation is the most immediate, most challenging, and most deeply personal way of contacting the real world. The heart and core of Buddhist meditation consists in what is called samasati, which is right mindfulness. The practice of mindfulness involves the methodical development of a simple mental faculty that is always available to us, but is seldom employed to its full advantage. Usually we use this faculty just in a superficial manner. The faculty is the faculty of awareness or attention. In our usual dealings with the world, the first moment of attention with which any experience begins is almost immediately overrun by associative thoughts and mental constructions, conceptual constructions. And so these conceptual constructions subordinate our direct experience to our practical aims and usually to our ego-centered motivations. The methodical practice of mindfulness aims at sustaining, making continuous this initial moment of attention. So through repeated practice, the development of mindfulness transforms attention into a steady and continuous, powerful beam of awareness that can be used to investigate the deep habits and patterns of thought and emotion, and can even penetrate into the deep underlying currents of conscious experience itself. My own teacher, the German monk Venerable Nyanaponika Thera, wrote that the practice of right mindfulness is, quote, the master key for knowing the mind, the perfect tool for shaping the mind, and the manifestation of the mind that has been liberated. Okay, so far I've been dealing with the way Buddhism can help us at the level of individual or personal transformation. But now I also want to speak about the way in which Buddhist principles can help us in our communal life, particularly with respect to the formulation of public policy. Some of the public problems or communal problems we face today, as I've already mentioned, include costly and debilitating wars, violations of human rights, the expanding gap between the poor and the wealthy, international trafficking in drugs, women, and children, the exploitation, overexploitation of the Earth's resources, and global warming. And what is most striking when we consider these problems as a whole is what I call their essentially symptomatic character. That is, beneath their apparent diversity, they can be seen to be just many manifestations of a deep and hidden spiritual malignancy that's infecting human society. And the common root of all of these problems might be briefly described as a stubborn insistence on placing narrow, short-term, self-centered interests above the long-range good of the broader human community. And by self-interest, I also include the narrow interests of the social or ethnic groups to which we might happen to belong. Okay, the Buddha's teaching offers us two valuable tools to help us extricate ourselves from this tangle. One is its probing analysis of the psychological springs of human suffering, and the other is its precise path of moral and mental development. The Buddha explains that the hidden springs of collective suffering are the same as those of our personal suffering. That is, the unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. Traditional Buddhism explains these as the causes of personal suffering, but by taking a wider view, we can also see them as the sources of social, economic, and political suffering. Through the domination of greed, the world becomes transformed into a global marketplace in which people are reduced to the status of producers and consumers. Through the prevalence of hatred, national, religious, and ethnic differences become the breeding ground of suspicion and enmity, even erupting in violence and brutal cycles of revenge. And delusion bolsters the other two unwholesome roots with false beliefs and political ideologies, usually promoted to justify the policies of those in positions of power. So, while changes in social structures and in policies are surely necessary to counteract our social, economic, and political problems, what I would say is that, from a Buddhist point of view, they aren't enough. I would say that what is needed above all else is a new orientation, what I would call a kind of universal consciousness that will enable us to regard others as being essentially the same as oneself. We have to learn to reject the demands of self-interest and acquire this universal perspective from which the welfare of all appears to be just as important as our own good. That is, we have to outgrow the narrow, egocentric and ethnocentric attitudes to which we are normally committed, and instead embrace a world-centric ethic that gives priority to the well-being of all. Such a world-centric ethic should be molded upon three guidelines. First, we have to overcome exploitative greed with global generosity, helpfulness, and cooperation. Second, to replace hatred, suspicion, and vengeance with a policy of kindness, tolerance, and forgiveness. And third, we have to recognize that the world is an interconnected whole, such that irresponsible behavior anywhere has potentially harmful consequences everywhere. These guidelines can constitute the nucleus of a global ethic to which all of the world's great spiritual traditions could easily subscribe without requiring any kind of exclusive adherence to Buddhism. The chief values that underlie this ethic are what in Buddhism we call loving kindness and compassion, values affirmed by all the great spiritual traditions. Through loving kindness, we recognize that all other people in this world want to live happily and peacefully, just like ourselves. And through compassion, we feel the suffering of others as our own and work to alleviate their suffering. Okay, this call for a world-centric ethic doesn't spring from mere capricious moral idealism or from wishful thinking, but it rests upon a solid, pragmatic foundation. In the long run, to blindly pursue our narrow self-interest is to undermine, to harm our real long-term interest. And so by acting out of blind, deluded self-interest, we contribute to social disintegration, social chaos, to ecological devastation. It's just as if we are sitting on the branch of a tree, on the side close to the trunk, sawing away the branch that lies, sitting out on the branch away from the tree, away from the trunk, sawing away at the branch. As we get further and further down the branch, eventually we reach the point where, yes, we do get the wood that we need to build our table or chair, but we come crashing down along with it, maybe to our death or to deadly pain and suffering. Okay, so far I've been speaking about the contribution that Buddhism can make to the West and to the human future of Western civilization. But now I want to say some words about the contribution that the West can make to Buddhism. In my view, what Buddhism can learn from the West is the dynamism of the West, the readiness of the Western mind to engage actively with the task of social transformation, and most importantly, the consciousness propounded by the best Western thinkers of the need for social justice and human rights. Thus, in my view, the challenge facing Buddhism today is to show greater concern for social and economic justice. If Buddhism is truly about overcoming suffering, it cannot neglect the social and economic dimensions of contemporary human suffering. Buddhism originally arose as a path to liberation among renunciants who had left the household life and stepped out of the rigid class structure of Indian society. But even from his position outside the social order, the Buddha continued to be a keen observer of the society around him. In his discourses, Okay, it's working. In his discourses, the Buddha laid down clear guidelines that define the distinctive marks of a just society. In the present day world, the Buddha's teaching acquires a new and compelling urgency, specifically with regard to this problem of social justice. The need to establish Dhamma in the sense of righteousness or virtue is the need not only to promote Buddhism as a system of religious, spiritual doctrines and practices, but to promote justice at all levels, social, economic, and political. And to promote justice means that it's also our responsibility to criticize and challenge injustice wherever we find it, to detect it, to protest against it, and to pull away the curtains that protect it, the curtains of deception and falsehood. Injustice can thrive only behind the veil of deception and falsehood. When the veil is pulled away and when the truth is made known, then injustice has to wither and fall away. So the great challenge facing Buddhism and Buddhists today is to come forward as a voice for justice in the world, to become a voice of conscience for all those victims of social, economic, and political injustice who cannot stand up and speak for themselves. I want to meet the CEO of Google after this talk. Okay, the Buddha says that ignorance and craving are the root causes of suffering. When we hear this, we usually think of ignorance and craving as the forces driving us through samsara, the round of repeated rebirths, or of ignorance and craving as the causes of our personal suffering. But when we hear this, we might also think of other things. We might think of the global corporations extending their reach over the world without regard for the indigenous economies that they dominate and undermine. We might think of the merchants of arms who make millions of dollars by selling weapons to those intent on waging war. We might think of aggressive nations that seek to use their military might to dominate the globe, killing thousands of helpless women and children. We might think of the millions of women. We might think of the millions of women in the brothels of South and Southeast Asia, forced into a life of misery and shame. And we might think of prisoners of conscience, forgotten by the world, yearning for democracy, imprisoned by harsh, autocratic regimes. It's said that the Buddha's mission, the reason for his appearing in the world, is to free beings from suffering by uprooting greed, hatred, and delusion. In our present day, greed, hatred, and delusion are not simply matters of our individual minds, but they've acquired a global reach, extending even to the villages and towns in the remote corners of the world, producing misery and suffering as their consequence. And so, at the present time, the challenge facing Buddhism is to raise the Buddha's mission to a global scale, not merely by promoting the Dhamma among those who are privileged enough to be able to practice it in full leisure, but by helping those subject to the most bitter forms of suffering receive the justice for which they long. In my view, this is a very deeply ethical challenge facing contemporary Buddhism, and it's a challenge that Buddhism must meet if it is to share in the Buddha's ongoing mission. Okay, this brings to the close the main part of my talk, but I just want to mention some project that we, group of Buddhists in the East Coast, started as a way of fulfilling, at least in part, this challenge that faces contemporary Buddhism. Some years ago, myself and some of my Dhamma friends and students felt the need to find a way to put the compassion of Buddhism into practice in a way that addresses people who suffer from economic and social injustice and deprivation. And so we established an organization that we call Buddhist Global Relief, which has as its primary mission to address the problems of alleviating poverty, and particularly global hunger and chronic malnutrition. We've been in existence now for two and a half years, and two of our board members are here with us today. One is Kim Behan, she is the executive director of BGR, and the other is Sylvie Sun, she is a board member and the chair of the fundraising committee. In the 2.5 years that we've been in existence, we've launched projects in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, including Afghanistan and Pakistan, Africa, Mali, Niger, South Africa, in Haiti, and also in the United States, where there's a lot of hunger and malnutrition. We've put out here some brochures about our organization, so we invite those of you who are interested to please feel welcome and come and take a brochure, and then to check out our website to learn more. There's also these annual reports, which I was using to hold my paper. So I'll put all of these out, and please, all of you who are interested, please feel welcome to pick one up. Okay, so I want to thank you. First, I thank Meng for inviting me to give this talk, and I thank you all for your attention. Excuse me? Sure. Okay, Meng says I could take a couple of questions. So please, if anybody has any questions, please feel welcome to ask. But Don't ask difficult ones. Okay, so please, at your convenience.
Hi, I'm afraid this might be a difficult question.
Okay.
But can you cite any examples in the past of where Buddhist teachings have been beneficial on a broad societal scale to achieve the sort of thing that you think we need to do now?
Okay, that's a very good question. I would mention probably the sterling example of the application of Buddha's social principles to the task of improving the condition of society was King Asoka of India. Of course, the information that we have about his reign is dependent upon the rock edicts that he himself commissioned to be put up. But it's said that as King Asoka he actively promoted the well-being of his subjects. He built hospitals which provided medical care for free. He set up food distribution centers which would distribute food to the needy. He gave wealth to the poor, to his poor subjects. I think he abolished the death penalty within his reign. And he lived a very pious religious life. The example of King Ashoka was followed by some of the great Buddhist kings of Sri Lanka, who also built hospitals for the subjects, even hospitals for animals, so that sick animals could receive care there. And to find out more details, if you go on the internet, you could look up edicts of King Asoka. I think you could find it through Google.
Kind of wondering, for Western capitalism,
Yeah.
enlightened self-interest is a very
Yeah.
key principle,
Yeah.
which seems to kind of there's a very direct conflict with some of what you were saying. So I'm just kind of wondering, do you see that, and how do you see that could be
Okay,
resolved?
I think that's a very important question. And one thing we should understand is that the Buddha's teaching that he gave to monastics of full renunciation was not the teaching that he gave to his lay disciples. To his lay disciples, he taught them that they should work diligently at their jobs, that they should earn money. He encouraged them to be wealthy, but not to earn the wealth by exploiting others. And then he taught the lay disciples, once they acquire wealth, to use the wealth wisely in ways intended to promote first their own well-being and the well-being of their families. He didn't teach them to live in poverty and to reject all the normal commodities that one needs to live comfortably and happily. But he also taught that with the wealth that one earns, one should set aside a portion for emergencies. This would be maybe the equivalent to insurance payments. One should set aside a portion for developing one's business. This would be like new investments. And then one should use a portion for generosity and charity, for helping the poor and needy, and for providing alms to the renunciants, the monks and nuns of any religion, not only Buddhism, but in India it was the common tradition for renunciants in any spiritual community to get their sustenance by alms round. And so the Buddha taught his lay disciples to give alms offerings to the ascetics of all the religious traditions.